H.P. Lovecraft. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, from August 20th, 1890, until March 15, 1937, was an American author who achieved posthumous fame through his influential works of horror fiction. Virtually unknown and published only in pulp magazines before he died in poverty, he is now regarded as one of the most significant 20th century authors in his genre. Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island, where he spent most of his life. Among his most celebrated tales are The Call of Cthulhu and The Shadow over Innsmouth, both canonical to the Cthulhu Mythos. Never able to support himself from earnings as author and editor, Lovecraft saw commercial success increasingly elude him in his later period, partly because he lacked the confidence and drive to promote himself. He subsisted in progressively straitened circumstances in his last years. An inheritance was completely spent by the time he died at the age of 46. Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890, in his family home at 194 Engell Street in Providence, Rhode Island. The house was demolished in 1961. He was the only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft, a traveling salesman of jewelry and precious metals, and Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, who could trace her ancestry to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1631. Both of his parents were of entirely English ancestry, and most of his ancestors had been in New England since the colonial period. His great-grandfather, Joseph Lovecraft Jr., emigrated to Rochester, New York from Devon, England in 1831. In 1893, when Lovecraft was 3, his father became acutely psychotic and was placed in the Providence Psychiatric Institution, the Butler Hospital, where he remained until his death in 1898. H.P. Lovecraft maintained throughout his life that his father had died in a condition of paralysis brought on by nervous exhaustion. Although it has been suggested his father's mental illness may have been caused by syphilis, neither the younger Lovecraft nor his mother, who also died in Butler Hospital, seem to have shown signs of being infected with the disease. After the father's hospitalization, Lovecraft was raised by his mother, his 2 maternal aunts, Lillian Delora Phillips and Annie Emmeline Phillips, and his maternal grandfather Whipple Van Buren Phillips, an American businessman. All 5 resided together in the family home. Lovecraft was a prodigy, reciting poetry at the age of 3 and writing complete poems by 6. His grandfather encouraged his reading, providing him with classics such as 1001 Nights, Thomas Bulfinch's Age of Fable, and children's versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. His grandfather also stirred the boy's interest in the weird by telling him his own original tales of Gothic horror. The UAPA reinvigorated Lovecraft and incited him to contribute many poems and essays. In 1916, his first published story, The Alchemist, appeared in the United Amateur Press Association. The earliest commercially published work came in 1922, when he was 31. By this time, he had begun to build what became a huge network of correspondence. His lengthy and frequent missives would make him one of the great letter writers of the century. Among his correspondents were Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, Clark Aston Smith, and Robert E. Howard, who did the Conan the Barbarian series. Many former aspiring authors later paid tribute to his mentoring and encouragement through the correspondence. His oeuvre is sometimes seen as consisting of three periods: an early Edgar Allan Poe influence, followed by a Lord Dunsany-inspired dream cycle, and finally the Cthulhu Mythos stories. However, many distinctive ideas and entities present in the third period were introduced in the earlier works, such as the 1917 story Dagon, and the threefold classification is partly overlapping. Throughout his life, selling stories and paid literary work for others did not provide enough to cover Lovecraft's basic expenses. Living frugally, he subsisted on an inheritance that was nearly depleted by the time of his last years. He sometimes went without food to afford the cost of mailing letters. Eventually, he was forced to move to smaller and meaner lodgings with his surviving aunt. He was also deeply affected by the suicide of his correspondent Robert E. Howard. In early 1937, Lovecraft was diagnosed with cancer of the small intestine and suffered from malnutrition as a result. He lived in constant pain until his death on March 15, 1937 in Providence. In accordance with his lifelong scientific curiosity, he kept a diary of his illness until close to the moment of his death. Lovecraft was listed along with his parents on a Phillips family monument. That was not enough for his fans, who in 1977 raised the money to buy him a headstone of his own Swan Point Cemetery, on which they had inscribed Lovecraft's name, the dates of his birth and death, and the phrase, "I am Providence," a line from one of his personal letters. Groups of enthusiasts annually observe the anniversaries of Lovecraft's death at Ladd Observatory and of his birth at his gravesite. In July 2013, the Providence City Council designated the intersection of Engel and Prospect Streets near the author's former residences as H.P. Lovecraft Memorial Square and installed a commemorative sign.